All right. All right. All right. So welcome everyone. Today for our meeting here at the Luke Krieger chapter, we are excited to have Alex Painter, and he is a graduate of Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, and was selected to be part of the 2024 Jerry Malloy Negro League Conference in Cooperstown, New York. Today we're gonna hear about more about Bud Fowler and the 1902 Indianapolis Colored League. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Alex Painter.
Hey, good evening, everyone. First of all, great to see everybody. Sorry, I know a couple of you, a few of you actually, but haven't met the rest of you. And fellow SABR member, I guess technically my home chapter is the Oscar Charleston Indianapolis chapter. But I'm a Fort Wayne native, so perhaps like some of you, I'm a Northern Indiana guy, and so I knew there was a Fort Wayne chapter, and only after talking with Steve and Andy did I realize there was a fellow or a companion Northern Indiana chapter just a little bit further west. So this Lou Krieger chapter, I might have to make this one a home chapter as well. Thanks for having me. I really do appreciate it. Just a little bit about me, as Andy mentioned. So I was born and raised in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I went to Snyder High School and played football there. I actually didn't play baseball there. I had a brother who played baseball at Snyder, but I did not. I was a football player there, and I ended up at Earlham College to play football. And I don't know how much you know, if anyone knows anything about Earlham College football. You learn a lot of humility there, especially after playing for Snyder for 4 years. We learned a lot of humility playing football for Earlham, which of course, unfortunately, the program is defunct after that 56 odd game losing streak, but have made a home here in Richmond and have stayed here. I have a wife and 3 small children. Actually, not as small as they used to be, I suppose. They're 10, 9, and 9, but a huge baseball fan. And with a specialization, I suppose, in Indiana baseball, but also Negro Leagues baseball. And just to kind of cue this particular project up. So Bud Fowler was, for lack of a better phrase, a baseball nomad in the 19th century. I'm not sure of everyone's familiarity with Fowler. He was part of the class of 2022 Baseball Hall of Fame, prolific baseball player in the 19th century, the first professional black baseball player when he debuted in 1874 for the Lynn Live Oaks out in Massachusetts. So he was the first black baseball player to basically earn a paycheck in organized baseball, and made it his life mission to spread baseball. And I think that was something that took a very long time for us baseball fans to really wrap our arms around and really recognize. So I'll get more into Bud's story, but really to again tee up this particular project. So again, Bud, player, organizer, manager, coach, advocate, evangelist of the game. And so it was reported in pretty much every meaningful biography, Brian McKenna's SABR biography, Jeffrey Michael Lang's Bud Fowler biography, that he had died of, so I study history and politics, I didn't study medicine, but pernicious anemia. So in other words, from an injury that he had suffered in 1902 in Indianapolis. When he was sliding to second, stealing a base, he broke a rib, which bent inward, which gave him kind of a lot of trouble for the rest of his days. He died in 1913. So for the last 11 years of his life, he kind of suffered from the effects of this injury. And so this has been repeated and oft repeated over and over again. But there was really no context given to, like, well, why was he in Indianapolis in the first place, right? What was he doing there? And the most substantive explanation of that was in Paul DeBono's, who was another fellow SABR member, by the way, his biography, or not biography, pardon me, his account of the Indianapolis ABCs, which put Fowler in Indianapolis for this all black baseball league in Indianapolis. But really, these two threads had never really been pulled together. And so I just kind of did some good old fashioned, gumshoeing, nose to the grindstone to really kind of put together a narrative over Fowler's involvement in the Hoosier State, and also that summer of 1902, what was going on. how did that all play out? And I was, I'd written some articles about it and was fortunate enough to have pitched it, as Andy mentioned, to the Jerry Malloy Negro Leagues conference, and it was selected as a paper. So just this last month, I was able to present that at the Malloy conference, which was in Cooperstown at the National Baseball, the Baseball Hall of Fame. So Fowler. So if you're otherwise unaware of Fowler's legacy or his playing career, he played everywhere, quite literally. I mean, everywhere. And he jumped from team to team because that was kind of how it was. He would go to a team, the team would fold up, or he'd get kicked off the team, mostly on account of his race, and he would just go to the next team. And so that's what he did. And then it got to the point where he'd form his own teams and he'd coach his own teams, and he was a promoter and an organizer. He's also widely credited with the first man to wear shin guards to a baseball game. Now, he didn't play catcher; he played second base. But when he was in the International League, when he would cover second base or when he'd go to turn a double play, the spikes would come at him so hard, and he was a fairly diminutive guy, that he decided, to heck with this, I'm coming out and I'm going to put on some shin guards to kind of try to protect myself. So that's another piece of his legacy. And so for a guy who was widely credited as being the greatest Black baseball player during his life, he died in not really relative. He died, he was destitute. There's really no nice way or to say that. He was completely destitute when he passed away. And he died in 1913. And he was from right outside the Cooperstown area, actually. And he actually was in a unmarked grave for 74 years. The SABR chapter, the local SABR chapter, worked back in the mid 80s, actually 1987, to get him a final resting place, a marker for his final resting place. So Bud Fowler, who was one of the greatest baseball players of the 19th century, was actually buried in an unmarked grave for quite some time, much longer than how long his grave has been marked. And so, Andy, I have a PowerPoint. If you don't mind sharing, or actually, you've already got it. We're good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get in here, folks. But by all means, I just want to say once more that I'm very, very appreciative to be here. And I promise you, I will make tie it all together at least one time to Luke Criger, who, of course, is the namesake of the chapter. He'll make an appearance in our story. That I assure you. It's been 5 years, and I still sometimes struggle to make Zoom work properly. Just one moment here. Okay, cool. Come on, from beginning. Is everybody seeing the presentation? It's not in presentation mode. It actually looks normal. It looks good. Okay. Hey, thanks, Steve. All right. So the topic at hand here is Bud Fowler in the overlooked 1902 Indianapolis Colored Baseball League. But as I kind of gave the folks at Cooperstown just a little bit of a 30-second commercial here. So a lot of my research has been around Indiana and Black baseball. And so something that is of major consequence here is this gentleman. His name is John Merida. He is a Spiceland, Indiana native. So if you know your Indiana geography, that's over in Henry County. The county seat is Newcastle. So this was more appropriate, I suppose, when we were at the Baseball Hall of Fame. But the Baseball Hall of Fame just debuted a new exhibit called Souls of the Game. And this photograph was actually featured in Souls of the Game. Merida was a guy who played in pre-Negro National Leagues, so before the Black baseball really got organized. He played for the Indianapolis ABCs in 1907, 8, 9, and then a little bit in 1910 before he passed away very suddenly in 1911 of spinal meningitis. Essentially the same thing that took out Naps hurler Addie Joss, essentially about a month within the month of when Addie was stricken with the disease and went very quickly too. But he was one of the most prolific sluggers of the dead ball era, which I know makes him a little bit paradoxical. But like our man, Bud Fowler, he was buried in an unmarked plot, although John was buried in an unmarked plot for only, I say only, in major air quotes, for 65 years. And so quite honored and pleased to see John's legacy is kind of being captured by the Baseball Hall of Fame in their new exhibit. So if you happen to make your way up to Cooperstown anytime between now and when the exhibit closes, I think in next June, I believe, or maybe late May, make sure you take special note of this photograph here in the Souls of the Game exhibit of Hoosier native John Merida and a couple of his white Spiceland, Indiana teammates, because John played exclusively on white teams until he was signed by Bud Fowler's Cincinnati Black Tourists in 1905. Okay, so again, the topic of this is Bud Fowler in the overlooked 1902 Indianapolis Colored Baseball League. And just right out of the chute, a bit of a quick caveat. I use the term overlooked, but again, it's very possible that even in our baseball circles, and I know we're all diehards, that unknown might be more appropriate term to use. It might be more liberally applied here. But the fact that Bud is now a Hall of Famer makes this effort, in my opinion, more crucial to spread awareness to. Even though the league itself was destined to fail, spoiler alert. And by the way, if anyone wants this slide deck afterwards, feel free to holler. So I'm actually going to we're going to start at the end of Fowler's life and then work our way backwards, because I think that tells the story perhaps a little bit, I know, reverse chronological order, but it actually might pull the strings a little bit nicer here for us. So again, as I mentioned, Bud's final years were spent in very poor health, destitution, and he lived most of his final years at his sister's house in Frankfort, New York. And he was trying to barber hair fast enough to supply, to support himself and to afford adequate medical care. And it was also during his incredibly nomadic baseball career that he had also often barber hair to kind of supplement his income. So there's this photograph here that stands in contrast to a couple of the photographs. There's not many photographs of Bud, but this is one that's taken later in life. He's clearly in a little bit poorer health. The most famous photograph of Bud, I believe, is when he's wearing his Findlay Sluggers jersey when he's a much younger man. But again, the photograph certainly stands in contrast to the other images that we have of Bud to kind of show his physical condition deteriorating a bit. But saying it plainly, Bud's last several years on Earth were fairly miserable. In his last months, he began this furious, candid letter-writing campaign to several of baseball's then bigwigs, such as Charles Comiskey, Connie Mack, Ban Johnson, and Thomas J. Lynch. The Lynch letter here is on the left-hand side. At this point, he's pleading for financial support. There's no record of his pleas being answered, and he died on February 26, 1913, again, officially of pernicious anemia, but likely several causes led to his end. But and if you have a set of eagle eyes on you, you may note that this letter to Lynch is dated February 4th, 1913. So just a few weeks before he passed away. And an excerpt of the letter reads, quote, "I was always an upright, straight man, and I am practically one of the fathers of the game. I am now down and out. I need some assistance to provide a few wants that I need while I remain on this earth." So he was buried in an unmarked grave again, once more, for nearly 75 years. So continuing to, again, work backwards. So if we were in 1913, let's jump backwards to 1908. In September of 1908, Sporting Life magazine reported that Bud Fowler, who was, quote, "the greatest ball player who ever lived," was destitute and dying of consumption. You can see that here. And they're really trying to drive this point home because in a separate September issue, Bud was quoted in the Wise Sayings of Great Men section down here. "Fewer flowers to the dead and a little more charity to the living would help some." It really drove home again this point that Bud must have been in dire straits. And however, what we know about Bud and what made Bud Fowler was truly his resiliency. So he fired off a letter to the Sporting Life magazine, which a summary of was printed a few months later, that says, quote again, "Bud Fowler, the veteran colored player, writes us from his home in Frankfort, New York, that he has not consumption at all. An X-ray examination revealed that he has, for the last 6 years, so counting backwards, 1902, suffering from an injury sustained while stealing a base in Indianapolis. He broke his lower left rib, which bent inward, which pierced his kidney. So again, just to give a little context to this little piece, this injury has been pretty much recalled in every major Fowler in major Fowler account. You know, this base getting injured while stealing a base in Indianapolis. So now let's add some context to it. It's because it's very, very significant. So 1902, Bud, to say it in a way my son does, he shoots his shot right in the Hoosier State. So again, by this time, he's been in baseball for nearly 3 decades as a player, a manager, a promoter, an organizer, you name it. He's done virtually everything, everywhere. And in 1901, he ends up in Monrovia, Indiana. He organized an all-black team in Monrovia that competed in the greater Indianapolis area that summer. And this is of note too, certainly that is something of a rarity during the exclusionary era of baseball. Bud also began submitting scouting reports that were published in the Sporting Life magazine during this time, oftentimes of Cincinnati Reds players. He'd offer his 2 cents about Reds prospects, and they were printed in the publication, which again, very rare. So the Hoosier State was actually an old haunt for Bud. In 1888, he reported to a team in Lafayette, Indiana. They were literally called the Strawberry Blondes, and they cut him because he wasn't a strawberry blonde. So I don't know how that actually happened, how he ended up getting there in the first place. But he was quickly dismissed on account of essentially his race. And he then joined the Crawfordsville Hoosiers in that same league. The Central Interstate League was the circuit. Anyways, in 1896, he formed an all-black team in Muncie, Indiana, which he called the Muncie Londons, and they were sponsored by the London Clothing Company that was in Muncie. The team folded after a couple weeks, but they did score several victories, including one over the Fort Wayne Farmers, which was the Cleveland Spiders affiliate at that time. Now, of course, before he went on to become the personal catcher for Cy Young, Lou Criger was the starting catcher for the Fort Wayne Farmers, who battled Bud Fowler's Muncie Londons in April and May of 1896. So there we go. We had to bring it back to Lou Criger here, but Lou would have squared off against Bud in 1896. So back to 1902. Bud went about organizing another team. This one he called his Eastern Colored Stars. So yes, Bud was forming a team, but he was also enterprising, as he liked to do. He had his sights set on forming an all-black baseball league in Indianapolis. He had actually tried something like that a few years earlier in Lima, Ohio, but that quickly fizzled before any games could be played. Now, if pulling off something like this in Indianapolis is ambitious, trying to do something in Lima, Ohio is very ambitious. And I say that with love. My mom and dad were both born in Lima, Ohio, but all-black baseball league in Lima, Ohio doesn't have success stamped on it by any stretch of the imagination. But he understood, kind of as a victim of poor infrastructure around independent, leagueless black baseball barnstorming teams, he understood what the benefits of an organized league would bring. And of course, he understood that a city the size of Indianapolis could potentially support this endeavor, again, perhaps a little bit better than Lima. And he was a bit of a Nostradamus here. In 1904, he shared this quote with the Cincinnati Enquirer, which said, "One of these days, a few people with enough nerve will take a chance and form a colored league of about 8 cities and pull off a barrel of money," end quote. Now, this is interesting because exactly 16 years later, the Negro National League is formed by a gentleman named Rube Foster. And there are exactly 8 teams in the Negro National League. Okay, at any rate, we'll keep marching here. By the way, this presentation was designed to be 24 and a half minutes. So because that was how much they gave me in Cooperstown. So if I start to get a little quick, someone just say, "Alex, slow down, slow down." But anyway, so Bud's in Indianapolis. Indianapolis. He has his team, the Eastern Colored Stars in 1902, and he wants to drum up some support, right? So he gathered support first from the Indianapolis Recorder, which was Indianapolis's black-run newspaper. And it was owned by this gentleman here named George Felden Stewart, a visionary, if you will. So George's older brother, Charles, who despite my best efforts, I could not find a photo of. Charles was a printer who had taught George the tricks of the trade. And Charles, again, not this gentleman, unfortunately, but this gentleman's older brother actually volunteered to be president of this new Indianapolis-based black baseball league. Bud appointed himself secretary. Now here's where it gets a little good, I think anyways. Also joining the fray is this guy. He was the powerful, well-connected Randolph Butler was his name. He owned a local watering hole in Indianapolis on West 15th Street. Ran, as he was known, or also the senator, as his pals called him. He had this brilliant mustache, which I have never seen a photo of this gentleman without this big mustache. He was constantly puffing a cigar. And Butler was actually pretty good pals with a guy named Thomas Taggart. If that name rings a bell, it's because he was the mayor of Indianapolis. So being friends with Thomas Taggart had its advantages. Butler could actually keep his saloon open on Sundays. Apparently, the police officers would literally look the other way when they were walking in front of the raucous of Butler's saloon on Sundays. So Butler had just formed a brand new team called the Indianapolis ABCs, and he wanted to get in Fowler's League too. And so the ABCs would actually ultimately become one of the most important franchises of the Negro Leagues. And they would have a presence in Indianapolis all the way through the 1940s. So Oscar Charleston, Biz Mackey, Ben Taylor, those are three Hall of Famers who suited up for the Indianapolis ABCs, but other guys like Dizzy Dismukes, Connie Day, Candy Jim Taylor, C.I. Taylor, Rabbit Shively. These are just a handful of the great players who went on to suit up for the ABCs. Now, you can't talk about this team without talking about how they got their name, right? Two theories exist. One states that they took the first letter of the last name of their three managers or their three-person leadership team when they first started. So George Abrams, who's wearing the black hat here, George Abrams was their on-the-field manager. And then Rand Butler here was their owner. And then another guy named Conoyer was also part of team management. Abrams, Butler, Conoyer, ABC. The other theory that exists, which actually seems to hold some decent water, is that they were sponsored by the American Brewing Company, which isn't a stretch given how Butler made his living. This is given further credence. So this is the team's first ever publicized team photograph from 1905. And you can see right over this gentleman's shoulder, there's a sign that says ABC Beer. Okay, so we have the Eastern Colored Stars. We have the Indianapolis ABCs. And then another team called the Herculeans joined up as well. And then another called the Vendomes, who are likely affiliated with the local Vendome Hotel, also pledged their support for Fowler's League. So we have now 4 teams. So the league's formation was announced via the Indianapolis News on July 1st. The founding meeting was held the day before, according to the paper, on June 30th. And the announcement here, and it has our slate of officers as well, Charles Stewart, Bud Fowler, and Rand Butler. It does mention that the games would start on Independence Day that week. So I know in every group of baseball fans, there's at least one stadium junkie, right? There has to be, possibly one, maybe two, or maybe all of us. So you're like, hey, okay, where are they going to play their games? Well, I'm glad you asked. So the Newby Oval was actually built just a few years before in 1898, and it served as a predecessor to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So oftentimes what happened, and this happened in driving parks as they're often called everywhere, you know, these bicycle tracks, they'd pitch the infield games here on the infield, or excuse me, they pitch the baseball games on the infield grass. So my pal here, Bruce, is in this chat, in the Zoom room too. Bruce, there used to be a park that looked just like this over where our Kohl's department store is here in Richmond, and they do the same thing. There was a driving park for bicycles and later automobiles, and then the baseball games were pitched here on the infield grass. Okay, so and I use the term predecessor to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway very intentionally and without hyperbole. This is from the Indianapolis Motorcycle Preservation Society's website, and I have it quoted here. And that is, quote, "The Newby Oval continued to hold exciting races through 1902, when it was proposed that automobile races begin being held instead of bicycle races. So the Newby Oval was not built for automobile races. So in 1903, the facility was sold and taken apart. In its place, about 6 miles away, became the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, founded by Arthur Newby and 3 others. Also, if you're into cycling history, the name Major Taylor may loom large or ring some bells. He competed extensively at Newby Oval. And as we find out here, the Newby Oval is commonly referred to as the driving park. That was kind of colloquial for across the country, really, for parks like this that you could have races at. So today there is this newly installed marker. It's actually about 2 years old now. Yeah, because I think I snapped a picture of it. The picture here is from 2022, right after they had installed it. So there is a newly installed marker of the Oval's old site in Indianapolis. Unfortunately, as you might imagine, there's no record, or there's no mention, I should say, of Bud Fowler's 1902 Indianapolis Colored Baseball League. Let's keep talking about Newby here really quick, because it is very interesting. It did host a number of other types of events, not just races, not just baseball games, concerts, convocations, circuses, vaudeville events, such as this one here, earlier in the summer of 1902, which sadly, despite even the presence of Coyne's comedy dogs, was unfortunately canceled early due to low patronage. So kind of reminds me of a lot of the solar eclipse events that a lot of people planned across the country, at least especially here in Richmond. We had a shindig planned, and unfortunately, we didn't get the foot traffic we thought we were going to get either. So vaudeville at the Newby Oval kind of suffered a similar fate. All right, so to level set, we have kind of this intriguing cast of significant characters. We have the birth of a legendary Negro Leagues franchise, a hugely significant venue for these games. And so you might be thinking, did they actually play any baseball? Well, let's move on. The league's first official game was played the morning of July 4th at Newby Oval between the ABCs and the Vendomes. The ABCs, as we find out later, won in fairly dominant fashion, 15-4, and attendance was reportedly fair. So throughout the month of July, the Indianapolis Recorder faithfully reported as much colored baseball league action as they could. In the July 26th issue of the Recorder, again, that same month, they even solicited help from their readership, crowdsourcing, if you will, about a century before the term was formally coined. They wrote, quote, "We wish to state that all news concerning non-league baseball games, if brought or made known to us, will be cheerfully published, as we are desirous of having a non-league percentage column." But league standings were printed in the July 19th, 26th, and the August 2nd issues. And, for a league, this has really been kind of hiding in plain sight. Frankly, there's really no other way to describe this effort in the Indianapolis, for the Indianapolis Colored Baseball League. It's been begging for all these things to kind of get pulled together. But sadly, much like the efforts that preceded the Indianapolis Colored Baseball League, the circuit unfortunately did not last very long. In their August 2nd issue, the Recorder relayed as much to the readers. Oops. Oh, shucks. Hold on a sec. My slides got out of order, but here we go. Rumors have reached our office that the league has broken up, as we think that as we think that the public has shown more interest than ever in baseball affairs this year, we hope the rumors are untrue. Unfortunately, the rumors were not untrue. This was the last reporting of the league. It lasted less than a month. The Indianapolis ABCs, soon to be a national fixture in the national black baseball scene, participated in 6 games. They won all 6 and outscored their opponents 59-20. So the modern day baseball researcher is able to find 8 total games that were reported in the local paper. Looking at the games, so when we think about Bud in suffering of his injury, sliding into second base, is it possible that it was during the July 19th or 26th game against the Indianapolis ABCs, or perhaps this game against the Vendomes, which, despite my very best efforts, I could not figure out the exact date which it was played. We'll never know. But what a story we seem to have here. But this is the exhaustive list of, at least from what I was able to compile, of all of the games in the Indianapolis Colored Baseball League. So what killed the league? These are good questions. What I can share is that most of the teams, and most definitely the Indianapolis ABCs, continued to play ball throughout the summer. So perhaps it was the sale of Newby Oval. When we were kind of talking about Newby Oval earlier, you might have picked up that it was torn apart in 1902, which would have been the time when this league was going on. So perhaps it was the Newby Oval going up for sale, which would have effectively orphaned the league. Perhaps it was the perceived lack of competitive parity. The Indianapolis ABCs were heads and tails better than every other team in the league. And of course, as we know, when you got a small league and one team just runs roughshod over it, that's not a whole lot of fun for anyone. Perhaps it was Fowler's injury, though. So if Fowler suffered an injury that effectively laid him up for the rest of his life, I imagine in the short term, that was probably really debilitating. And he was, without a doubt, if we know much about Bud, he would have been the one pulling the strings for the whole league from a leadership standpoint. Most certainly, he was most experienced. He was a baseball man. He'd been at it for decades. So perhaps it was Fowler's injury that really kind of hamstrung the league. But either way, the league, after less than a month and at least 8 discovered games, was finished. So what is the legacy of the Indianapolis Colored Baseball League then? Again, a significant step in the pre-Negro National League state of black baseball in forming a league. The scope was definitely a lot smaller, but the fact that the league did have some fairly influential people backing it, and it did achieve liftoff. So in other words, there was no failure to launch. A lot of black baseball efforts that you see that preceded this, they'd get the band together, they'd have all these, what turned out to be delusions of grandeur, and they never played any games. That's actually a fairly common story for black baseball around this time. That's important that games were played. Fowler's name being attached to the effort also gives it some serious cachet. The fact that the Indianapolis ABCs have something of an origin story is basically mouthwatering, in my opinion. The inaugural roster for the ABCs is shared a couple months later because, again, they're still playing. And as you can see, winning 22 out of 25. They're playing really well. And some of these names here are really consequential and significant in early black baseball here. John Henry Lola, George Board, Shinny Prim, James Schaller. I still haven't figured out who Uncle Boozer is, but he was the mascot. So maybe he was just someone who frequented Butler's watering hole. But anyways, so though Fowler may have been temporarily hobbled, he stayed at it. He kept at it. And from 1903 through 1905, he banded together his black tourists out of Cincinnati and Columbus. I mentioned John Merida at the top of this presentation. That's where John Merida gets his introduction into black baseball after playing on exclusively all white teams for 8 years. So he tried his best to stay in baseball, even while dealing with health issues and dealing with this injury, which he was fairly successful at for the rest of his life. So the Indianapolis Colored League is just a small, but in my opinion, hugely significant piece of Bud's legacy. And to use men who are much more eloquent than I, what is Bud's legacy? I mentioned Jeffrey Michael Lang's bio. He says, quote, Bud Fowler never wavered in his passion for the national pastime and held on to the ever-receding dream that there was a future for African Americans in the national pastime. If not on integrated teams at the highest level of the game, at least owners and managers of all Black clubs. Baseball historian Peter Morris echoes this sentiment, quote, despite the treatment he received, Bud Fowler never lost his passion for baseball and never gave up on the hope that the day would come that baseball players would be judged on their merits rather than the color of their skin. So that was what I had an opportunity to speak on at Cooperstown. I welcome any questions or discussion items, and I appreciate your time.
Alex, very thorough. I appreciate that. One thing, I live in Elkhart, Indiana. So one thing I thought of was in 1888, I know Elkhart was in a league. I don't know if it was the same league that Bud was. So he had another, if it was, he had another interaction with Elkhart people.
So they would have been in that Central Inter. That makes a good bit of sense. Were they in the old Central Interstate League?
Well, that's what I was. I couldn't. I don't want to go away and look at my notes while you're talking there. So I can't remember. I know somewhere in my research, there were only a few times over time that Elkhart was in organized baseball, and 1888 was about the furthest back, and it was that one season. Some of these leagues pop up and then they go away and pop up and go away. In 1888,
that's right.
One of
I'll do some digging on that. It looks like maybe the Elkhart Blue Sox.
Well, the Elkhart Blue Sox were from 1910, and that was the Indiana-Michigan League, or the Michigan-Indiana League if you were on the other side of the state line. But they were in that league, and I know Berrien Springs was the winner of that. And I did a fair amount of research on that 20-some years ago.
Awesome.
All right, Alex,
I noticed when they were selling the Newbie Oval. I knew nothing about that. That was interesting that they were selling it off parcel by parcel. They were talking about the ticket booths, and they were and the tarpaulins and all that kind of stuff. So.
Oh yeah, they limb by limb, and it was pretty remarkable how quickly then they started. They just went down the road and started construction on the Speedway, and that was. It was fairly short order from the time Newbie shut down, and it was Arthur Newbie himself too who kind of formed the founding group for the Speedway. But yeah, they sold it all. They took it apart.
It was where the Blue Sox played was a place they called it the Driving Park in Elkhart. You were right about it. Although I never saw any instances of bike races, but they raced horses. They even talked about Barney Oldfield. I think Barney Oldfield might have raced his car there a little bit, but they didn't have regular cars. And a plane, I think one of the first planes to land in Elkhart was there. I used to live across the street from where this place was, and was there a while before I discovered that all those descriptions sound familiar. Places, a business called Nibco is there now, and they still have hedges. They talked about hedges and the spike fence and all that. You can you don't have to use a lot of imagination. That was over 100 years ago, but there's got some things that are still there.
Yeah. Mark, yes.
I just want to thank you for including me. I found this very fascinating. I've heard the stories about the Negro Leagues and everything. My question is, you mentioned about the Baseball Hall of Fame. I'm wondering why I know it's a little bit different, why there's no mention of it in the Negro Baseball Hall of Fame as well about this, because this is something I never heard of, and I found it very fascinating.
Yeah, that's a good question, Mark. And being someone I've probably spent the last 6-7 years, particularly really delving into Negro Leagues history. It's the reason why it's not mentioned is because it's completely untapped. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic when I say that. Here in Richmond, where Bruce and I live, there was 150 games involving Black traveling baseball teams that came here. And there was just no one who had really pulled that history together. And I was one of the great rewards, things that I've done that's been most rewarding is being able to kind of chronicle the Black baseball history of Richmond, Indiana. We're 35,000 people, and the history, the amount of it's mind-boggling. And everyone, we had 19 baseball Hall of Famers that came through Richmond, and really nobody knew very well. So there's this groundswell of Black baseball history, and it's everywhere. And unfortunately, it's just one of those things we haven't been great at documenting, and there's discoveries made almost weekly on this. So it's not surprising that really we've had this kind of scattershot reporting of Bud's injury in this league, but they never had really been married together. It's not too terribly surprising, but I agree with you, Mark. It's something that needs to be really much more widely proliferated.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Hi, Ed.
Hey, Alex, maybe put a little bit of historical context around the Black community in Indianapolis at the turn of the previous century. I mean, I think most of us know perhaps a little bit more about the Black migration and its impact on the Black community in Indianapolis, but there was a pretty rich history that goes back to that period of time and even before. So because of, when I arrived in Indiana to go to undergraduate, many years ago, I began to learn more about Indiana history. I grew up as a military brat, so all over the place. And so that context of what the community was like at that point would interest me if you can add a little bit to that part of the story.
Oh, I'm not, unfortunately, I'd love to be able to add something meaningful to that, Ed. I'm not sure I'm the best person to talk about. Obviously, the Great Migration, if you look at the Great Migration drove people up by the thousands. And if you were to look at, and by the way, Paul DeBono's on this talk. He knows, he's forgotten more about this than I know. I was mentioning, and Paul can, I told this to Paul, I have his book near me at all times. It's become about the Indianapolis ABCs. Paul wrote the book on the Indianapolis ABCs quite literally. But if you were to look at the ball players who comprised of those early Indianapolis teams, very few of them were from Indianapolis. There's some Kentuckys. They're obviously mostly from the Deep South or had roots to the Deep South. Unfortunately, I have not done much of a deep dive on what it was like, society was like for Blacks in Indianapolis around this time. So unfortunately, I'm not. I'd have to take that one back to the lab. Unfortunately, perhaps Paul might be able to add some context because he's really an expert.
I just saw this was going on here at the last minute and jumped on, but I think that is interesting. I know there's a few historians in Indianapolis who've done projects on that topic, and I don't know if you saw this kind of there was a Netflix movie about Madam C.J. Walker. Did you guys see that at all? So, and that's almost cartoonish. However, it does it kind of gives you an idea of there was movers and shakers in society, and there was things going on. Some of the architectural landmarks are still there in Indianapolis, but I think you probably would need to read some of the works that have been done by local historians of African American history. Especially the Indiana Avenue area, Madam C.J. Walker, all to really get a feel for it.
Yeah, Paul, I'm going to cite your work here for a moment, just to kind of talk about this Great Migration, to add some context to this. So again, census figures in 1860, there were 830 people of color in Indianapolis. By 1870, there were 4,000, and by 1910, there were 23,000. So there's a story there, certainly, Ed. There certainly is.
Most of what I remember about this is a lot of the immigrants came out from Kentucky. So you'll find the migration from, and even to this day, you talk to people, a lot of the roots are from Kentucky. So,
Yeah.
No, because I think it was just it interested me in part as well to think about. I mean, I think most baseball fans think of major league cities in the context of the 16 franchises from the early part of last century, and don't think about some other cities. They may know well about Baltimore's great teams of the 1890s, but Indianapolis, which had a Federal League team, and Buffalo, when I would talk about that, apparently my research showed that Buffalo was the 10th largest city in the United States in 1900. And, most people would have no idea of how major a city Buffalo was at one time in terms of its population. But Indianapolis, I think a lot of people, particularly from, who are not Hoosiers, have just little of that kind of context about Indianapolis and its importance and a lot of things, perhaps beyond, the Indianapolis 500.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right.
All right, did anybody have any more questions?
I hate to do this to you, Alex.
Hmm.
Would you mind, do you know about the Bob Feller Satchel Paige thing in Richmond, Ohio back in 1946? So,
Absolutely.
can you tell me a little bit about that? I would love to hear what you have to say about that. How it went down and all that. Did they fly their planes into Richmond, or how did that go down?
All right. They sure did. They did. So it is incredibly random. So Bob Feller and Satchel Paige went on a barnstorming tour in the offseason 1946. It was actually kind of one of the last few barnstorming tours that happened because Major League Baseball was going to put the clamps on this one. Feller was routinely pitching 350 innings each year during the regular season, and he was ultimately baseball kind of, again, put the kibosh on this kind of thing because people didn't want their guys to get hurt. Anyways, so it was really common that Feller and his White Stars, they did it, I believe, twice, but in 46, Feller brought a team of White Stars, Satchel Paige brought his team of Colored Stars, and they kind of did this whole tour of much of the country. And they went by plane, which was almost unheard of at that time. And what's really quite striking about it is they hit all your usual suspects, right? They did Bugle Field, Baltimore. They went to New York. They played in Cleveland at League Park. They played in Cincinnati at I think it was at Crosley. Then they went up to Dayton, Ohio, which was that seems like a stretch to me. They're on all big league cities, and then they hit Dayton, Ohio, which was a really good minor league city at that time. And just for craps and giggles, I'll watch my link. They jumped over the border and actually flew into Richmond, Indiana, and they played a game in Richmond at a park called Municipal Stadium, which if you come to Richmond, it's now called McBride Field, but it still stands. It was built in 1936 with Public Works Administration dollars. Anyways, but yes, those planes flew into Richmond's tiny little airport. Those two teams drove into the YMCA in town, and they showered, and then they played an exhibition game, which the Feller All-Stars, I believe, won 8-7. And they flew out, and they kept going, and they kept working their way west until I think they ended up, might have ended up in California, LA. So they kind of crisscrossed the entire country, and it's still really, it's almost inexplicable that they stopped at Richmond. But we had a single A team for the Boston Braves called the Richmond Roses, which was kind of a nod to a really thriving rose industry that we used to have here in Richmond. But yeah, So let's see. On Feller's team that year of note, he had Bob Lemon pitched for him, Hall of Famer. Oh, daggone it, the little shortstop from the Yankees.
Rizzuto?
Bill Verzito?
Thank you. Oh my gosh, I got 2 minutes. Phil Rizzuto was out there. Thank you guys, appreciate that. This is one room, you know, like you can count on for that kind of help. And so Rizzuto was at short. Dutch Leonard pitched, and on Page's team, he had Hilton Smith, another Hall of Famer, pitched for his team. He had Hank Thompson play second base. Hank Thompson was phenomenal, by the way. He integrated 2 baseball teams, the Giants and the St. Louis Browns. And he was, people remember the 1954 catch in the World Series by Willie Mays, but I think Hank Thompson walked 7 or 8 times in that series and set a modern record. He was brilliant. But anyways, so yeah, they stopped in Richmond. I'll stop the story there before I spin off totally off the rails, but I appreciate the question.
It's remarkable they went to Richmond. I was like, wow, that's got to be the smallest town.
Delightfully random, indeed. Yes. Quick shameless plug, because you all are Michiana folks too. I happen to, I mentioned I'm from Fort Wayne. I belong to a very large Catholic brood, and we're big Notre Dame fans. And so I got a work coming up. It'll be released this football season. Notre Dame football's first All-American was a gentleman named Louis Salmon. He was an All-American in 1903. He was the first Walter Camp guy. You know, back when Notre Dame was a third-rate football school and even lower academic institution. Well, actually, that's probably not fair. They were probably a third-rate academic institution and a 10th-rate football school. And Lou Salmon his greatness could not be denied. So he ends up on Walter Camp's 3rd-team All-American list. And quite a story, you know, son of Irish immigrants, and just makes good. And anyways, so been working on his biography for about 4 years. And so finally I've decided it's finished. You know, these things are, you just kind of decide they're finished. Rather, they could have been finished 2 years ago, but I guess I prolonged the process. But that'll be out this football season. So I hope you keep your eyes and ears open for it.
You come to the bookstore there at Notre Dame and send copies? Is that in the works? In the plans?
Yes, Zach. There should be copies available at Notre Dame's bookstore. I work pretty closely with the archives, and interestingly, I had to work really closely with the archives because they had a photograph that just like it had to be included. Lou Salmon was Notre Dame's first great football player. And he part of his legacy was probably diminished because he didn't do a lot of the self-promotion stuff. He didn't come back to campus a lot to, you know, bang the drum and all that stuff. He was just kind of a quiet, humble, diffident kind of guy. He did come back to campus twice. Once was homecoming in 1920 because he had to see this guy who everybody said, hey, Lou, he's the best Notre Dame football player since you. I promise. And we know 1920, he had to go see George Gipp. And there's a photograph of Lou 15 years after graduation and Gipp together. So this is November 6, 1920. So ostensibly, this is one of the last photographs of Gipp alive. He died the next month. Wild. So Lou Salmon, just keep an eye. It'll be in the Notre Dame bookstore eventually.
No, I think Steve, Notre Dame, even up until a few years before the pandemic, they were a lot better under the old management about having authors come for Friday afternoon and Saturday morning to sign their books. They've just changed the ownership again about a year ago. So I don't know if, you know, they're trying to do something better in terms of having people, you know, come to get books signed. But
Okay.
during the earlier,
there's a natural, and I remember the Hammis, you know, era of that bookstore, and that they definitely did that kind of thing then.
yeah, I mean, I can remember lines 50 deep, after I got there in 2006 until maybe, the middle of the next decade. But, yeah, hopefully you can, get a gig like that. Cause, if you could sell 40 or 50 books, that's a great day.
That is a good thing. I always joke. I've written some things, but the audience tends to be just like I did the Negro Leagues history of Richmond, Indiana, which fused Richmond's history, baseball history, and Negro Leagues history kind of all together in one narrative. But what I like to say, I write books that will sell dozens of copies, right?
Very narrow focus.
Yes.
People like what you do, but it's not a wide, ranging thing.
So yeah, this first Notre Dame book will probably have a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, being a lifelong Cincinnati Reds fan, one of my favorite players from my formative years as a Reds fan was from Whiteland, George Crowe, and of course his brother,
Great.
equally well known. Always thought it was pretty ironic considering the racial treatment of George Crowe, that he was from Whiteland. That was the name of the town that he was from, but a great enough basketball player to be recognized in his time, despite racial prejudice, which and I think, unfortunately, except for one year when Ted Kluszewski got hurt and the Reds played Crowe a lot, he didn't he didn't get nearly the opportunity to play that probably his abilities would have deserved. Another guy that I've done a good bit of talking about and work on, Curt Flood, said that Crowe had a lot to do with making him a better hitter, and gives a lot of credit when he was traded by the Reds to the Cardinals, that Crowe really helped him a lot.
Yeah. Crowe had that one really spectacular year. Might have been like 57 or 58. I think he was an all-star. I don't know. I did this weird thing in my mind actually not too long ago. I'm like, how many ball players during that time, let's call it the 50s or 40s, 50s, wore spectacles? There just weren't very many. DiMaggio's brother wore spectacles. George Crowe wore spectacles. There weren't very many ball players. I don't know why. It was almost like you couldn't wear glasses and play baseball at that level. There just weren't very many guys. But yeah, George Crowe was awesome, and a Negro leaguer before he broke in with the Reds too. He suited up for the Black Yankees.
Jeff Carmen came along right about that time too, or right a little before that.
What's that, Steve? Sorry.
Well, Chuck Harmon from Washington, Indiana, was a little bit before that, and he played for the Reds.
That's right. Yeah, he integrated the Reds.
Yeah. Great University of Toledo individual. So another little Ohio reference to drop other side of the border.
That's right. We try to not acknowledge those people when possible, but sometimes you have to, right?
Well,
Paul is an expatriate, right? He used to be in Indiana, now he's in Cincinnati, right? I think he's muted.
You're muted up, Paul. We want to hear this.
Something profound there, but I don't know what he's saying.
No, I'm in Cincinnati proper now. Been here for 20-some years.
Yeah.
So I've kind of made the switch here, but we get back fairly often. So yeah, I mean, George Crowe. I was reading about Brooks Lawrence too the other day. He was on that team with George Crowe, and I think Frank Robinson came on too. Anyway, but yeah, I'm a Buckeye Hoosier, whatever you want to call me. So
No, most of my favorite teams are in Cleveland.
well,
so
I know
can't
you're a
like
Cleveland fan,
Oh,
yeah.
big time, big time. So I have to acknowledge these people. What am I saying? I have to.
I got you.
Well, one of the stories about Curt Flood that seems to make sense is that he was traded because the Reds already had Frank Robinson and Vada Pinson was on the way, and they couldn't start an all black outfield in Cincinnati, and they thought Pinson had a lot more career potential than Flood. And Tommy Harper also. I mean, all these guys grew up in Oakland, and they were coached by a white gentleman named George Poles, Powles, who put something like a dozen guys into Major League Baseball that he coached some way or another, including in that is Bill Russell, first coach of an NBA, black coach of an NBA team, and Frank Robinson, first manager. But Poles himself is a very interesting story, and that's again, a lot of those players were born in the South, and their families moved to Oakland because of the shipyards there that provided work. Yeah, it would have been interesting if the Reds had spent, most of the late 50s and early 60s with Pinson, Flood, and Robinson in their outfield.
Yeah. I had to think of the same thing. The Indians had Luke Easter, and they had Satchel Paige, and they had Larry Doby. So there's this world that they had this swirling rumor that they had hit their quota, so they shipped off Minnie Minoso, and you're just
I'm on.
well. I've wrote down everybody's names here. I'll go through the SABR directory. I'll write you all a line, so hopefully we can keep talking. And Andy and Steve, keep me in the loop here with the Criger chapter. I'd love to become a more regular member. Would love to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Steve, it's been a while.
Yeah, that's why I knew Paul when he was writing, or when the ABC's book came out.
Right.
That's a classic now.
Well, you know what, Steve, I'm trying to remember how
I
many
think it's
years.
25 years, and no,
Yeah,
it's more, close to 30 years.
At least, right. Yeah. Yeah, it's been a while.
There's a 94 in Louisville, I think was the
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And here it is,
I met Pee Wee.
2024.
I met Pee Wee Reese in an elevator at that convention. I'll
There you go.
never forget that.
I think that's the last time that the SABR convention was in a non MLB city, I think.
Is that right? Yeah.
I believe so. But that's the first one I went to was Louisville.
So Ed Edmonds, are you in Cincinnati?
No, I live in Edina, Minnesota these days.
Okay, gotcha.
I grew up a Reds fan because my dad, who was in the military for most of World War II through the early part of this century when he passed away, was from Cincinnati. He went to high school in Mount Healthy. And then when I was a boy, my grandparents lived in Green Hills. And so and actually I was an Ohio resident. One of the reasons I ended up in law school at the University of Toledo, because I was a state resident. Because of my dad's military connection, he had always remained a resident. And so my SABR affiliation these days, other than the Criger chapter. So I taught at Notre Dame from 2006 until about 2022 when I moved up here. I still actually have a connection to the university in that we have law students who work in the athletic department on compliance related matters. And so I still have that component. Try to keep my connection up with South Bend due to that. So now you have more biographical history about me.
Well,
Than
no,
anybody.
it's yeah.
Oh.
I mean, it's nice to, but it sounds like you still kind of follow the red. So yeah, good.
Yeah, and today was another day that Green pitches a great 7 innings.
Yeah.
And comes in and costs him the game. And
I heard.
I was thinking, I wonder if sometimes he doesn't come out of the shower muttering at whoever blew a win point.
Oh boy.
Happened
Yeah.
a lot.
Well, it's nice to meet you, all of you. Sorry you joined late. I got to keep up on these things, but yeah.
Well, Paul, it's good to see you as always, man. And these guys can vouch. I mentioned your work right at the top of it because that's how much I feel about it. Dave Stalker says hello.
Oh yeah, I haven't had any connection with Dave for a while, but yeah.
He wanted you to
Watertown,
know that,
Wisconsin.
Yep, you got it. He wanted you to know that there's a monument going up that's going to have Fowler and Lou Criger on it up in his neck of the woods.
Awesome.
So he wanted
Yeah,
me to make sure
I
you
got
knew
to
that.
go up there, see his Hall of Fame, some of his stuff at his house, but then he took me around to the 25-30 mile radius of where he lives there and different monuments he placed. This was, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And of course, the Lou Criger. Now I'm longer than that because the Lou Criger monument in Elkhart's been there since 2012, and that has everything to do with Dave, because the monument company and his project, is a part of that. They're in Wisconsin.
Wow.
So it's
That's
cool how
pretty-
everybody's kind of connected in that way, and they're we're all in these different places, but we're connected to
Well,
baseball and different reasons.
Oh yeah, you can't. Yeah, it's like you shake the tree and all the nuts fall out of it.
6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, or whatever.
Yes,
All that.
that's right. The degrees of
Take
separation.
a prolonging this a little bit, Alex. Talk about how neat it is to have events in the plaque gallery at the Hall of Fame.
Oh man, yes, it was incredible. I'd never been to the Hall of Fame, so this was my kind of first foray there, and it was almost too much to take in. And it's like the Hall of Fame, it's like the one place you can go and you see everyone has their handkerchiefs out and they're dabbing their eyes. It's just because it's that kind of place. The connection was I told my wife, I'm like, hey, Alicia, because I brought my son and my wife up to the trip with me. I said, I will be a Cooperstown street urchin for the rest of my days. I will just live here. And, that didn't fly. She said, hey, you got to get back to India. I'm like, okay, fine. But it was incredible. It was the plaque gallery to hear folks speak. Yeah. And they have this new theater. It's just lovely, which was where my part of the session was. Oh, it was just incredible. Great, momentous occasion for a first timer like me. So.
All right. I want to just I'm probably going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to take this time and thank Alex for the presentation. We all very much enjoyed it. I want to thank our chair Steve Crawford is helping organizing the meeting as well. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you guys at Minneapolis next month.
Thank you all. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Mark. Hey, Steve, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank
Oh,
you
yes.
all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks,
Take
Andy.
care all.
Great job,
Pleasure.
everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you all.